They all promised they'd be there, not vaguely, not casually, clearly. "Don't worry, we've got you," they said, one after another, like it was already decided. I remember sitting there, listening, letting that reassurance settle in, because this wasn't something small. This was surgery, recovery, the kind of situation where you don't just need help, you depend on it, and hearing them speak with that level of certainty made it easier to go through with everything. It made the risk feel manageable, because no matter what happened, I wouldn't be alone. At least, that's what I believed. The day of the surgery came faster than I expected. Hospitals have a way of making everything feel both rushed and slow at the same time. People moving quickly, conversations happening around you, but inside everything feels quiet, focused. I remember being wheeled in, thinking about what came next, not the procedure itself, but the recovery, the days after, because that's where support matters the most. And I held on to what they had said, that they would be there, that I wouldn't have to figure it out alone. When I woke up, everything felt heavy, not just physically, but mentally. That kind of disorientation where you're trying to piece together where you are, what just happened, and what comes next. The room was quiet, machines humming softly, and for a moment I expected to see someone there, sitting nearby, waiting, but there was no one. Just the stillness of the room and the realization that recovery had already started and I was starting it alone. I told myself not to think too much into it. It was still early. People have responsibilities, schedules, things to manage. Not being there immediately didn't mean they wouldn't show up later, so I focused on what I could control, breathing steadily, following instructions, letting time pass. Because sometimes you have to trust that people will follow through, even if it doesn't happen exactly when you expect it. The first day passed slowly. Nurses came in and out, checking vitals, adjusting things, asking questions. They were kind, professional, doing exactly what they were supposed to do, but it wasn't the same. There's a difference between care and presence. One is part of a job, the other is personal, and I kept waiting for that personal presence to show up. A message, a call, a visit, something that confirmed what I had been told before all of this started. By the second day, the waiting felt different, not anxious, not desperate, just noticeable. The absence wasn't dramatic, but it was there. Clear. I checked my phone more often than I needed to, not because I expected something urgent, but because I thought maybe I had missed something. A message, a call, but there was nothing that matched the promises I had been given. And that contrast started to settle in quietly. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they thought I needed rest. Maybe they didn't want to overwhelm me. Maybe they assumed someone else had already checked in. There are always explanations you can create when you don't want to accept the reality right away. And I let myself believe those explanations, at least for a while, because the alternative, that they simply didn't show up, felt heavier than I was ready to carry. By the third day, I stopped expecting them to walk through the door unexpectedly. That kind of hope fades quietly, not in a dramatic moment, but gradually, as time passes without anything changing. And once it fades, something else takes its place, clarity. Not harsh, not emotional, just clear. The kind of clarity that doesn't argue with reality. It simply accepts what's happening, even if it's not what you were told to expect. The hospital discharged me sooner than I thought they would. Medically, I was stable. Instructions were given, follow-ups scheduled, everything explained. On paper, everything was fine, but there's a difference between being medically ready and actually being ready. Recovery doesn't end when you leave the hospital, it starts there, and that's where support matters the most. Walking out of those doors, I realized I was stepping into that phase alone. The house was exactly how I left it, quiet, still, unchanged. No signs that anyone had prepared for my return, no adjustments, no effort. And that's when it really hit me, this wasn't a delay, they weren't coming. The first night back was the hardest. Not because of the pain, although that was there, steady and unavoidable, but because of the silence. Hospitals have noise, movement, people around you, even if they're strangers, but the house was different, completely still. Every small task felt bigger than it should have. Sitting down, standing up, reaching for something just out of range. Things you never think about until you have to do them slowly, carefully, alone. And in that silence, the absence of everyone who promised to be there became impossible to ignore. I moved carefully through the space, adjusting to limitations I wasn't fully prepared for. Every step required attention. Every movement had to be planned. It wasn't dramatic, it was just real. Recovery isn't about big moments, it's about small ones repeated over and over again. And doing all of that alone changes how those moments feel. They become heavier. Not because they're impossible, but because there's no one there to share even the smallest part of it. The next morning, I checked my phone again, not out of hope this time, but out of habit. There were messages, but not the kind I expected. Casual ones, short check-ins. How did it go? Hope you're okay. Nothing that reflected what had been promised before the surgery. Nothing that matched the level of support they said they would give. And that difference stood out more than anything else. I responded simply, "I'm home," no details, no explanation, just the truth. And even as I sent it, I realized something. I wasn't trying to pull them in anymore. I wasn't trying to remind them of what they said or what I needed, because at this point it wasn't about reminding. It was about recognizing what people actually do, not what they say they'll do. Hours passed, then the rest of the day. No follow-up, no calls asking if I needed anything, no one showing up unexpectedly, and with each passing hour the situation became clearer. This wasn't miscommunication, it wasn't bad timing, it was absence, simple and undeniable. And once you see something that clearly, you stop looking for other explanations. By the 5th day, I had found a rhythm, not an easy one, but a functional one. I figured out how to manage the basics, how to move without causing too much strain, how to plan tasks so I didn't exhaust myself too quickly. It wasn't ideal, but it was working. And in a strange way, that independence started to shift something inside me, because even in that situation, I was managing. But independence doesn't cancel out reality. There were moments, small ones, where it hit again. Reaching for something and realizing help would have made it easier. Sitting down and thinking about how different this could have been if even one person had followed through. Those thoughts didn't stay long, but they were there. Reminders of what was missing, not just physically, but emotionally. The messages continued, but they stayed surface level. No one asked the questions that actually mattered. No one showed the kind of concern that matched the situation, and at some point I stopped expecting it, not in a bitter way, just in a clear one. Expectations adjusted to match reality, and once that happens, things feel different, not heavier, just more honest. By the 10th day, something had fully shifted. I wasn't waiting anymore, not for messages, not for visits, not for anything. I had accepted the situation for what it was, and in that acceptance there was a kind of strength. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. The kind that comes from facing something directly and adapting to it without resistance. And then, on the 13th day, my phone rang. Not a message, not a casual check-in, a call from one of them. And the tone of that call was completely different. I looked at the phone for a moment before answering. Not out of hesitation, but because I already knew something was different. People don't suddenly switch from silence to calling unless something has changed on their side. And whatever that change was, I could feel it before I even picked up. So when I finally answered, I didn't rush to speak. I simply listened, because sometimes what people say first tells you everything. The tone was careful, not casual like the messages before, not distant. There was weight behind it, a pause before words, like they were being chosen more deliberately. And then came the question how I was doing, but this time it didn't feel routine. It felt uncertain, almost like they already knew the answer wouldn't be simple, and that uncertainty said more than the question itself. I didn't over-explain. I didn't go into detail about the past 13 days. I just told the truth in the simplest way possible. I managed. No accusation, no frustration, just clarity. And sometimes a simple truth carries more impact than a long explanation, because it leaves space for the other person to realize what it really means. There was silence on the other end after that, not long, but noticeable. The kind of pause that happens when someone is processing something they didn't fully consider before. Because I managed doesn't just mean things were okay, it means they weren't there and things still had to be done. And that realization doesn't always come immediately. It settles in gradually. Then came the shift. The tone changed again, this time more direct. They acknowledged they hadn't been there the way they said they would. Not a full explanation, not a detailed apology, just an acknowledgement. And while it wasn't complete, it was something. because recognizing a gap is the first step toward understanding it. I didn't react emotionally. I didn't fill the space with reassurance or make it easier for them. I let the moment sit as it was, because sometimes people need to feel the weight of what they're saying without it being softened. Not to make them uncomfortable, but to make it real. And reality doesn't need to be forced, it just needs to be left alone long enough to be understood. They started explaining after that. Not excuses, but reasons. Schedules, responsibilities, things that got in the way. And while those reasons may have been valid on their own, they didn't change the outcome. Because at the end of it all, the result was the same. I had gone through those 13 days alone. And that's what mattered. I told them I understood. Not in a way that erased anything, but in a way that acknowledged what they were saying without denying what actually happened. Understanding doesn't mean agreement. It doesn't mean acceptance of the outcome. It just means you hear it clearly, and clarity is important because it keeps things honest. What came next was different. Less explanation, more reflection. The conversation shifted from what happened to what it meant. And that's where things start to change. Because once someone moves past explaining and starts reflecting, they're no longer trying to defend themselves. They're trying to understand their role in it. And that's a completely different place to speak from. And then they said something I didn't expect. Not a reason, not another explanation. Something simple but heavy enough to change everything between us. They didn't rush into it. There was a pause first, like they were deciding whether to say it the right way or avoid it completely. And then they said it. They apologized. Not casually, not in passing, but clearly. They admitted they should have been there, that they said they would be and they weren't. And hearing that wasn't dramatic, it wasn't overwhelming, it was quiet. But it carried weight because it was finally real. What made it different was the lack of excuses. There was no attempt to balance the apology with justification. No, but attached to it, just a direct acknowledgement of what happened. And that kind of accountability stands out, especially when it comes late, because it shows that something has shifted, not just in what they're saying, but in how they're seeing the situation. I stayed quiet for a moment after that, not because I didn't accept it, but because I wanted to let it exist as it was. Sometimes responding too quickly takes away from the weight of what's been said. And this moment didn't need to be rushed. It needed to settle, because this wasn't just about hearing an apology, it was about understanding what it actually meant. When I did respond, I didn't make it emotional. I didn't bring up every detail of those 13 days or turn it into something heavier than it already was. I just acknowledged it, because the purpose of this moment wasn't to prove how difficult it had been, it was to recognize that it happened and that it mattered. But I also made something clear. That what affected me wasn't just the absence, it was the promise before it, the certainty they gave me going into something serious, and the difference between those words and what actually happened. Because when someone depends on you, your words carry weight, and when those words don't match reality, that's where the real impact comes from. They didn't interrupt, they didn't defend themselves, they listened. And that listening felt different from before. It wasn't passive, it was active, intentional. The kind of listening where someone is actually trying to understand, not just waiting for their turn to respond. And that alone showed growth. The conversation shifted again after that. It became less about the past and more about awareness. They started recognizing things they hadn't thought about before. The position I was in, the level of dependence during recovery, the gap between what they assumed and what actually happened. And that awareness was important. Because without it, nothing really changes. I didn't rush to fix the relationship in that moment. I didn't say everything was fine or act like one conversation erased everything. Because rebuilding something requires more than one step. It requires consistency, time, and a clear understanding of what needs to be different moving forward. But I also didn't close the door. I didn't create distance out of frustration or hold onto the situation in a way that prevented anything from improving. I stayed present but grounded, open but aware. Because growth doesn't come from shutting everything down, it comes from allowing change while still protecting your boundaries. And just when it felt like the conversation was coming to an end, they said one more thing. Not an apology, not an explanation, something deeper. Something that made me realize this wasn't just about what they did, it was about what they were ready to change. What they said next wasn't complicated, it wasn't dramatic or overly emotional, but it was honest. They said they didn't just feel bad about what happened, they understood it now, not from their perspective, but from mine. And that difference mattered, because feeling bad can fade, but understanding changes how someone moves forward. I listened carefully, not just to the words, but to the intention behind them. This wasn't about fixing the past anymore. That couldn't be changed. It was about what came next. And for the first time since the surgery, it felt like we were finally talking about the same thing, not the situation, but its meaning. They told me they had been thinking about those 13 days, not just briefly, but in detail, realizing what it must have been like to handle everything alone, the physical effort, the silence, the adjustment, and more than that, the trust I had placed in them before it all started. That part stayed with them the most. I didn't respond immediately, because this wasn't a moment that needed quick words. It needed space, space for everything to settle into something real. And in that space, I realized something too. I wasn't holding on to anger. Not anymore. What I felt was clarity, and clarity is different. It doesn't push, it simply shows you what is. I told them something simple, that what mattered now wasn't what they said in that moment, it was what they would do next. Because consistency is what turns words into something real, and without it, even the best intentions don't last. That wasn't said as pressure, it was just truth, clear and steady. They didn't argue with that, they didn't try to promise anything big or immediate, they just accepted it, and that acceptance was important, because it showed they understood that rebuilding trust doesn't happen through words, it happens through time and action. And for the first time, that felt possible. Looking back, I realized something I hadn't fully seen before. Those 13 days didn't just show me who wasn't there, they showed me what I was capable of handling on my own. The strength to manage, to adapt, to keep moving forward even when things didn't go as planned. And that realization stayed with me more than anything else. Because sometimes the hardest situations don't just test your expectations, they reset them. They show you where you stand, what you rely on, and what you don't need as much as you thought. And once you see that clearly, you move differently. Not with distance, but with awareness. I didn't need everything to go back to how it was before. I didn't need to forget what happened. What I needed was something better, something more honest, more consistent, more real. And that's what I chose to move toward. Not based on promises, but based on actions I would see over time. They promised they'd be there. They weren't. So I went through it alone, and I made it through. And when they finally realized what that meant, it wasn't their apology that mattered most. It was the fact that I no longer needed the promise. Sometimes people don't show up, so you learn how to stand on your own, and that changes everything.